The Orris Project. Book 1, Origin and Earth, by David J. Salisbury. Episode 6. Chapter 3. Oceans. 1. Part 2 of the horrible Sterilex experience. Your mind woke up before any of your senses. The envoy awoke trapped in a dark, silent room. He could feel nothing. He could move nothing. No smell, no taste, nothing but his thoughts. He believed his heart had started beating again, and that he had started breathing again only because if he had not, he would not be awake. He knew he was not dreaming only because dreams had content. To make things worse, he had no sense of time passing at all. Two distinct comforts lifted his spirits. The first was that it was not his first time, and he knew it would not last long. After 10 to 30 minutes passed, his senses would return. The second was the most obvious. He woke up. He was alive. His mind wandered toward the buried alive scenario, but he scolded himself for even thinking about it. There was no reason to worry. There was nothing he could do about it until he could move and take the pill. Instead, he imagined breathing. He imagined his chest rising and falling. He imagined the thudding of his heart beating, echoing in his ear canals, an exercise he had used in the past to help coax him out of his coma. It had always worked, eventually. He counted the breaths he was creating in his mind to see how high he could get before the real thing arrhythmically conflicted with the patterns in his thoughts. Somewhere between 230 and 240, the feeling in his chest came back, and he had been counting much too fast. His breathing was there, but it was slow. He could hear nothing, but he could feel his chest rising and falling and the rhythmic bump, 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 bump of his heart, also slow. The next sensation to return was wonderful. It was his sense of smell, and what he smelled was rain. It meant not only was there a lot of water on the planet, but that he would not suffocate. It would be impossible to smell rain without being exposed to the open air. The feeling in his arms, legs, and face returned, and he could feel his salivary glands working overtime, producing a warm slick of saliva. He could taste again, but the taste in his mouth was bitter and metallic, horrible compared to the delightful smell of the rain. It was another several minutes later that he heard a far-off crash of thunder, and then he heard one that was much closer, and the rain itself. It was violent, but he could feel everything, and he was not wet. Lucky on top of lucky. The envoy was still lying on his left side in the same position he had been moments after taking the dose of time-traveling elixir. 400 million years was long enough on one side, and so he tried to roll himself onto his back. He was successful, but the pain that accompanied the movement was intense. He laid there, still buried in his blanket with his hood pulled over his face, in global pain, breathing and waiting for it to subside. Complete feeling was coming back to every facet of his body, and with it, the pain that accompanied his adjustment to being alive again. Every single tooth hurt. His eye sockets were two balls of fire, his joints and bones were throbbing, his skin itched everywhere, and his stomach was churning and nauseated. Before he could even think about his vision returning, he found that it had. Lightning struck so bright, it penetrated the 2 layers of blanket and hood, not to mention his eyelids, which lit up bright pink with an immediate baby blue afterimage. It was only a second after the flash that the thunder crashed, and he could not just hear it, he felt the vibration in the rock. The rain intensified. He focused on his breathing and on the sound of the rain and tried to push his pain and general torment to the back of his mind. I need water. This won't get much better until I get some water. He began unrolling himself out of the blanket. After one complete turn and with one to go, he hit his pain threshold and passed out. 2. He woke up 6 minutes later, and even though little time had passed, the rain had slowed considerably. There was no noticeable change to the pain, but he still had to get out of his sheathing. He started his unwrapping procedure again, much more slowly and carefully. After an hour, he felt the blanket fall away from his arm. He was on his back again and could hear a loud tick-tick sound on his head sock. Rain. He reached up with his right hand and removed the hood. The simple action was exhausting, and he relaxed all the muscles in his right arm and allowed it to fall. It slapped down on the flat, wet rock and sent a new bolt of pain screaming into his brain. Stupid, 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 he scolded himself. The bulk of the pain in his arm subsided after several seconds, and he remembered he had at least a foot of ledge before the drop-off. The envoy slowly, carefully, slid his body toward the ledge. After only 12 inches, he could feel the droplets crashing into his face. He smiled. Flat on his back, drips and drops hit his lips and tongue as his mouth was open to receive the delicious water. He laid there like that for 3 hours, slowly hydrating. He was falling asleep again and carefully rolled onto his right side, relaxing his entire body. His pains subsided, but the exhaustion remained. With rain still pelting the skin on his left cheek and temple, he placed a hand over his ear to prevent it from filling with water and fell asleep. 3. A cool breeze awoke the envoy. The rain had stopped and the clouds broke. Sunlight streamed in from overhead and heated the saturated floor of earth outside, but did not touch his face, as the apartment he had chosen blocked the direct light. Today's goal: sit up and drink as much of a bottle of water as I can, he thought. It seemed like an attainable goal. His movements were pain-free. The problem was his lack of energy. Every move he made exhausted him, and he would have to wait to recover before making another small move. After 4 attempts, he understood he would not be sitting up that afternoon. Instead, he crept over to his bag, pushed the satchel off it, and spent the next hour untying the throat. Once open enough to get his hand in, he reached for one of the water bottles made from that amazing Dory 10 plastic that he had taken with him from Osa. His bag, water bottles, purse, satchel, and even his clothing and his boots used Dory 10 for every stitch. They had taken the same material and spun it into thread, which they wove into the items. It was not as comfortable as natural materials, and he only wore the clothing when things like cotton were not available. He dragged the bottle out of his pack, and although he spilled a lot, he swallowed about half of it. His situation differed greatly from when he first arrived on Earth. He knew water was plentiful and did not care that he wasted some, but he needed the water that he had put in his system to do its magic. With his eyes closed, in the same position, he attempted to sleep without success. He breathed, and he daydreamed of bodies of water on the surface. He did not know exactly what to expect, but the driving rain made him optimistic. 4. The envoy woke up and noted the bright red sunlight spilling into the apartment. Either sunrise or sunset, he thought. Could I have slept all night? Without thinking about it, he lifted himself up to a sitting position, leaning on one outstretched arm. Only a moment passed before he realized that the simple action was something he could only have dreamed of doing mere hours earlier. Not wanting to overexert himself, he looked over at his pack and noted the empty water bottle on the ground next to it. He reached into the bag and withdrew another bottle, easily twisted off the cap and drank from it. Once the bottle was empty, he belched and started a rigorous stretching routine. He imagined he would get to a point where his energy failed or the pain came back and he would have to stop. But he finished the routine easily. The light in the apartment had shifted from a bright red to a brighter yellow. Sunrise. I can't believe I slept all night. He slid his backside over to the ledge and swung his legs over it so he could sit more comfortably. The landscape amazed him. It was a cave when he went under. He realized the roof, the entire roof, had collapsed across the expanse of the cave. This sparked another thought as he remembered the makeshift staircase he had built to ascend the 8-foot rise to the apartment ledge. He looked straight down to find his feet only inches from the sand and dirt below. Well, that's convenient, he thought. He wanted to slide off the ledge and take a try at standing upright at his full height. With his satchel around his neck and his bag on his back, he slid off the ledge and onto his feet. His legs collapsed beneath him, and after some quick thinking, he rolled down the slight decline instead of slapping face first into it. He sat up. Well, I have my supplies, but I just gave up my shelter. Nice job, idiot. His concern was minimal because he knew getting back up into the apartment would be possible if he needed to, but the sun was not baking him. It felt good on his skin, which still itched badly. He heard a rumble and scanned the part of the horizon he could see. There was a dark band of clouds to the west over the knee. The needle is gone. It was. After a moment of consideration, he believed it probably had not fallen but gradually sunk back down to the earth over countless years. He drank another bottle of water without moving from his crash site and tried to stand again. He could do it but saw stars once he was fully up, so he sat down again. Eat, he told himself. He ate. 5. The envoy slept where he had landed the day before, under the stars. He wanted to give the little food he had eaten time to digest and distribute its nutrition before he tried to stand again. The sun was pushing the night away to the east, and the air was cool. The breeze felt good on his itchy skin. He sat up and looked around. A clear sunrise had been coming in the east, but there were a lot of clouds above him, and it was still too dark to tell if they were rain clouds. He ate another piece of jerky. There would be a lot of walking in his future, and he knew his ribs were becoming visible. He was starving in the truest sense of the word. Following his instructions, the prep team on Telraid dried the meat, dressed it in a heavily salted oil, and sealed each piece individually in a thick Dory 10 packet while under a powerful vacuum. He could not imagine what it would be like trying to eat it if it had not been. It would probably be dust. After he finished his micro meal, he drank another bottle of water. In the east, the sky was much brighter, but above him was still black. Rain maybe, hopefully. He tried standing again. There were no stars, but his legs felt watery. He risked a step forward, then another. He stopped, stood tall with his head back, and breathed deeply. Oxygen was still a problem. As if his posture were some ritual pledge to the god of rain, the sky opened up and bathed his entire body. He laughed with delight. Standing in the downpour, he stripped off all his clothes and used hands full of wet sand to scrub his body down in the rain to clean himself. Next, he worked on his clothing, letting the articles saturate, wringing them out, and then repeating for good measure. Once he finished his cleaning, he kneeled in the dirt and found a piece of flat rock that had a sharp point as a feature. Holding the rock up in the rain, he also scrubbed it clean as well as he could with his hands and more sand. Still holding it before him, he let the droplets of rain crash into the surface and run off in his best effort to rinse it clean. Satisfied, he tilted the rock point down and to the top of his empty water bottle. He had 4 empty bottles, but he had left one of them back in the apartment hole, so he filled the 3 he had with him. It was slow work, but necessary. He stood and dressed, still in the rain. It soaked all his clothes through, and it felt wonderful. His skin no longer itched. He hung the waterlogged satchel around his neck and placed the waterlogged bag on his back. He walked the 7 steps it took to reach the apartment hole, reached in, and retrieved the empty water bottle. 1 step back, looking at the hole, he nodded. "Thank you." A rare spoken word from the envoy while on the planet with a population of 1. 6. After climbing out of what was once a cavern, and then a shallow valley, he stared at the ground and watched the rivulets of rainwater trickle across the earth. The envoy established his heading. It was not a foolproof method for finding larger bodies of water, but it was much better than guessing blindly. He walked and watched as trickles merged into tiny streams merged into small streams, and so on. He walked until the dark daylight faded into the true dark of night. It was still raining, and although it was becoming uncomfortable, he reminded himself of the times he would have killed for a little rain. In the fading light, he looked all around him for cover and found none. He walked until he could no longer see. 7. It was not possible to sleep well while being rained on. It did eventually stop, just as he saw the first signs of daylight emerging in the east. He was so exhausted he rolled away from the light to get an hour of good sleep while the sun came up. It worked, but he had a new problem. It was cool, almost cold, and it had rained all night. The fog was so thick that although he could see his hand stretched out at arm's length, he could not see much farther than that. He located the stream he had been following and continued to follow it, but it spilled into a marsh of concentrated puddles after only 10 minutes of walking. What do I do? He thought. There's nothing I can do but wait until this fog breaks, otherwise I could walk off a cliff. He laughed at the thought of taking 2 more steps and free-falling to his death. He stood where he was and sung a song from his time as a young man back on Osa. The sound was funny in the marsh. It sounded strange to his ears, or his voice could have changed after being under for hundreds of millions of years. He forgot about it before even finishing the song when he felt a breeze and saw the fog shifting and something dark close to where he stood. The first word he thought of when he could make out the dark object was mound, but it was bigger than that. It was more of a significant hill sloping up away from the marsh, which he could see stretched north. The envoy walked up the hill, hoping to get the best vantage point he could. He could see far enough that he no longer worried about walking off a sheer cliff, and it had the potential to be progress. The higher he climbed, the thinner the remaining fog got. He could see farther, maybe 100 yards, and the hill maintained its steady slope up. This could be perfect, he thought. I might find both from up here. He could see the blue of the sky. At that elevation, the fog had thinned to a weak haze. After a minute more, the fog disappeared, and he could see the summit of the hill. He looked around, amazed at the blanket of white in every direction. It was swirling and churning with the recent addition of the breeze. The sun was getting higher in the sky, and he knew it would only be a matter of 20 minutes or a half hour before it broke completely. He sat, ate, drank, and enjoyed the serenity before it was time to get back to work. The envoy watched as deep veins grew in the fog's mass. The veins built up into pockets, and then there were only thin streamers of gray-white vapor left. After a cursory glance at the revealed landscape, he gave his vision its best chance at succeeding and climbed to the top of the hill. Standing tall on the summit with a rudimentary visor made from his hands, he scanned 360 degrees of landscape and horizon. No oceans, no mountains. He repeated his scanning procedure 3 more times, looking for subtleties. On the mountain front, he came up with nothing. The highest point he could observe from the hill was the hill itself. The lack of mountains did not matter at that point. He needed the mountain for prolonged shelter, and he would not need prolonged shelter until he could find the ocean. He saw nothing that gave him hope, so he walked down the hill to the east, the same direction he had been traveling.